Right, sorry. I should really finish eating before I start videos. So, Chapter 1, A War of the Worldviews. He starts off with a few Richard Dawkins quotes, a few Peter Atkins quotes, basically exemplifying on their stance that faith is detrimental to science, it's a blind faith, it's belief without evidence. So how does Lennox address this? Well, let's have a quote here, text message. Of course, the Christian Apostle John writes in his biography of Jesus, "These things are written that you might believe." So you see, biblical faith is precisely that. It's belief with evidence, because the written word itself is evidence. There's even a second biblically quote in here as well, and on this kind of flimsy ground, Lennox next goes on to say that Dawkins' view that faith is belief without evidence, faith is blind, itself is not based on evidence. There is no evidence to say that faith is not based on evidence. Take that, Dawkins. And next he gives a survey of how many people in the scientific community kind of are believers, how many are not. And then he goes on to claim that this survey is kind of difficult to interpret, what exactly it means, which is a good point, so why did he put it in there? He does continue then to just name drop a few people: Francis Collins, Bill Phillips, whoever that is, Brian Heap, whoever that is, a load of other people. And then, but all these names, they don't stop that strident Mr. Dawkins, do they? No. He then says there's a number, he doesn't name them, but a number of scientists who seem to be at war with God. He then has a fun statement. Statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. That's a good sentence there. That makes a lot of sense. That's a good thing to hold to. Let's hope he doesn't go on to use a statement by a scientist as a statement of science within the next, say, paragraph, where he quotes Gillian Prance, what a name, Prance, as saying, "For many years I have believed that God is the great designer behind all nature. All my studies in science since then have confirmed my faith. I regard the Bible as my principal source of authority." Statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. That quote was actually introduced by saying Sir Gillian Prance gives a clear expression to his faith. Well, no, he just says his faith is confirmed by science, rather than actually saying what his faith is, which is a massive problem with this entire portion of the chapter. At no point does he actually explain what faith is. He just assumes that this kind of nebulous concept has been equally assumed by the reader, which it hasn't. I assume nothing, possibly. He's said that Dawkins thinks faith is blind, and all these other scientists are going, there's absolutely nothing backing up anything in that bit whatsoever. He does actually say, though, we'll deal with faith in Chapter 4, so we've got that to look forward to. Page 19. Militant atheists. Really? And this bit says, before going any further, we ought, however, to balance the account a little by citing some eminent scientists who do believe in God. Literally, the page opposite is what he's already done, with like a paragraph worth of citing people who do, and now he's going to address the balance by quoting some more. Mr. Lennox, balance is this kind of not it's this. That's what you're doing, and you've got like name upon name upon name. Like over here you've got Dawkins, which is, but it's your balancing is spinning my elbow into my face. So the next little bit of this chapter delves into the history of science. This is basically Lennox's major point throughout his debates and the book, that it's the monotheistic belief that a single creator God, a single, that's important, just the one, a single God is responsible for creating the universe, and it's that rationality, that knowable nature of the universe is logical and makes sense because it was created. That's what allows scientists to do science. That's what inspired people, their belief that the universe is knowable in this way. They thought, the universe must be knowable in this way. Let's do science. No, because, as he says himself, it was the Greeks that certainly kind of were the first to do science in any way that we would describe science. He goes on to then say that the Hebrew view that the universe is created and upheld by a single God is very much older than the worldview of the Greeks, and I literally have no idea what he's meant to mean by that, because just look at a timeline. Blech. He claims that the burst of knowledge through the 1700s, like Galileo and Newton, was built upon the medieval insistence that there was one creator God. And here's a lovely bit. Now, he's not suggesting that there's never been any kind of religious antagonism towards science. Brace yourselves. But Galileo himself did say, the Creator has endowed us with senses, reason and intellect, and didn't intend us to forego their use and by some other means to give us knowledge which we can attain by them. You see, so even Galileo was a staunch Christian, without which he would never have done his science in the first place. But I've got words for Mr. Lennox from another book that's bigger than yours. I mean, much all about Mr. Galileo, but first I'm dry, I need another cuppa. Marvellous. Right. So, Galileo. That quote comes from a letter he wrote to a friend of his, the Grand Duchess of somewhere, Tuscany. Basically, this entire letter is a little bit of a rant where Galileo is complaining that all the kind of the church people, a lot of his peers within the academic community that were still clinging to kind of Aristotelian viewpoints were kind of heavily criticising his astronomy. Here's the full bit. But I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason and intellect has intended us to forego their use and by some other means to give us knowledge which we can attain by them. He would not require us to deny sense and reason in physical matters which are set before our eyes and minds by direct experience or necessary demonstrations. Basically, don't tell us what to think when experiments and science say otherwise. He ends the letter by quoting someone else, that the intention of the Holy Ghost is to teach us how one goes to heaven, not how heaven goes. Galileo then was a firm believer, basically, that if you keep religion and dogma out of science, science can get on with the important process of actually discovering things. This would kind of point otherwise, that Galileo only did his science under the belief that the world was knowable because God had made it. I don't think there's any indication that that kind of thought has appeared in any of the minds of the people he's actually quoting. Back to Lennox, then he actually provides the sort of counter-argument to his entire point here by saying that just because a religion has supported science, or just because someone is inspired by their conviction in the religion, that the religion is necessarily true because of that. But and then Lennox, kind of his only answer to that is quite so, but the same can be said, of course, of atheism. But no one's said that was true of atheism. You've just given a counterpoint against someone saying that argument for either side when you're the only side doing that argument in the first place. You're not backing anything up here. The conviction doesn't make it true. I could be entirely convinced that making the best possible cup of tea will result in me possessing the power of flight. It results in an extraordinarily good cup of tea, but I have no wings. I'm talking bullshit. The next thing Lennox does is address myths of conflict. It's basically points within history where science and religion have this perceived kind of conflict together, and where there's been a big fight, and people always bring up these points that, oh look, there's a historical example of religious antagonism towards the progress of science. And he starts with Galileo. This is a really good book, by the way. Get that book. It's good, it's good. Again, he's making sure that we're aware that Galileo was a staunch Christian, which he was. He also says that Galileo's main opponents were secular philosophers clinging to the Aristotelian view that everything goes around the Earth. And Galileo was arguing for the Copernican system that everything goes around the sun, including the Earth goes around the sun. Possibly that way. It's unfair to call them secular philosophers, or maybe not unfair, because they might not have been linked to the church, but they weren't non-religious. They were religious. They were Christians. He's been a little dishonest by saying that when the very next line along he'll come out and say actually his supporters within the church, religious intellectuals, actually supported some of his science. That's true as well. A lot of the people in the church were very interested in Galileo. He had a lot of friends there. He certainly wasn't hated by the church. But it's a different thing to say that it was the secular, non-religious people that were clinging to Aristotelianism. The church clung to that also. What they were saying to Galileo and what they did to Copernicus was say, okay, your theory is very good mathematically and all that jazz. It's very nice, it's interesting, but that's all it is. It's a hypothesis, it's a thought experiment. You weren't allowed to kind of claim it was the truth because they clung so desperately to this Aristotelian thing where the Earth is the middle of everything. Also, interestingly enough, it wasn't his astronomy that actually got him into the most trouble. It was actually what the church was really bothered about was his thoughts on atomism and that everything was made of these fine elements, because that had repercussions to do with the Eucharist, the belief that those little wafery thingies turned into Jesus when you put them in your mouth. I don't know how that works, but according to what they thought of the atom theory that Galileo was arguing for in one of his works, they thought that was immense heresy, saying, oh, no, we can't let that out. The entire trial was, in that case, a kind of a sham trial. They basically told Galileo that we're going to try you on account of your heretical kind of Copernicanism. What they actually said was, look, they took him to one side. One of his mates said, look, if you don't plead guilty to the whole Copernican thing, we'll get you off with a kind of a light house arrest for the rest of your life. But if you bring in this anti-Eucharist stuff, we might have to torture you quite a lot. Is that okay? Galileo went, and basically went through the whole trial thing. It's all in there. That's quite a recent discovery. But yeah, the entire trial centred around Copernicism and how they did that. John Lennox said, it's a myth that he was tortured. He was never tortured. He was threatened with torture and under house arrest. Yes, he had good accommodation provided by his mates, but he wasn't allowed out, ever. Not even to see the doctor. He went blind. Kind of a kick in the nuts if you're an astronomer. Lennox also makes the point that Galileo himself was a bit arrogant in the way he kind of addresses things, which is also true. He was. In fact, he was a bit of a prick. That's his telescope there. He actually stole the idea for a telescope from Lippershey and completely ripped him off, made a better telescope within like 2 days of Lippershey visiting Italy, sold the new Galilean telescope by using his political influence to get a meeting before Lippershey. Lippershey was basically unknown through Italy, but he kind of got elsewhere. Git, basically. That is Giordano Bruno, who was tortured by the church for about 7 years before being burned at the stake. All he said was there might be life on other planets. Another myth of conflict is the Huxley-Wilberforce debate about evolution. That happened in 1860. Not going to go into that because it's boring and I don't know anything about it. Lennox finishes the chapter by saying the real battle is between naturalism and theism. He goes into a few kind of different ways you can express naturalism, either sort of politically or scientifically. Naturalism doesn't allow for a supernatural realm of things. I never get that either. This always has to be a supernatural, not like an undernatural. A kind of like the natural, not a better kind of supernatural kind of but an undernatural where everything's just a little bit shit like Birmingham. Basically, he sums it up with a Sagan quote: "The cosmos is all there is, or was, or ever shall be." Contrasting this to theism: "In the beginning, God made blah 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 blah." That's the end of that chapter. So the interesting things there are he completely glosses over or tries to make amends for in a kind of a very lame way that these are myths of conflict between religion and science. We've also got no demonstration of what faith actually is. Faith and religion and theism are just kind of all completely interchangeable throughout this chapter, depending on which kind of angle he wants to defend himself from. Also, there's no mention at all given for sort of deism, which is the only thing argued for. Is if there was a deist god, then surely all his arguments would hold true then. But he's saying no, it's purely naturalism versus theism. So there we go. Next time we'll be dealing with the scope and limits of science.